Barry Sherman was a jerk. In the ranks of completely unsympathetic, appalling human beings, he ranks up there with Jeffrey Epstein. He was a Canadian billionaire, but Sherman had a long list of court cases, over 1,200, filed by him and against him. And the crux of the allegations being that Sherman would betray, berate, or bully almost anyone if he could get away with it. And the biggest of his misdeeds ranks high up in Canadian corporate scummy practice, which is high praise indeed in a country of complacent, often complicit regulators. See, Barry Sherman ran a generic pharmaceutical company. And in the 1990s, they were testing a new drug for children out of the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital. One of the doctors helping with the research discovered in the middle of the clinical trials that the drug didn't just not work, but actually had harmful effects on the children. It was making them ill, if not risking their death. So she did what you would hope any physician would do. She immediately informed the rest of the research team, the children's parents, and the medical community that they were stopping the trial of the drug. Barry Sherman sued the doctor personally. To repeat, he took the doctor to court for making sure a drug that harmed children was pulled. Then he tried to get the doctor fired from the hospital and the University of Toronto where she was based, and he nearly succeeded. And then to ensure that everyone learned the lesson of never crossing Barry Sherman, even if children's lives were at risk, he kept the legal suit against the doctor going for 18 years. He was also immensely politically influential. Like Jeffrey Epstein, his connections were with the very top political class. At his funeral, to their shame, the former Ontario Health Minister gave one of the speeches. And that politician was joined by a host of other powerful political leaders and the then Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. Barry Sherman was also a massive Zionist. That's a prominent supporter of Israel. He gave huge amounts of money to Israeli causes and did enormous amounts of business in that country. And this is exactly the same as Jeffrey Epstein. Now, examining Epstein's social and political circle is like watching a game of musical chairs played with no chairs. The party is definitely over, so no one wants to admit that they were ever friends with him. However, there is one undeniable community of Jeffrey Epstein's. Just about all his closest connections were prominent members of the American Zionist movement. And this isn't to say that Jeffrey Epstein's death is linked to Israel or that someone in the Zionist community killed him or that members of the Zionist community took part in his sexual activities. But if this were a murder in the Italian community, I wouldn't necessarily think it was a mafia killing. But when the families around the victim are all named Bonanno, Colombo, Genovese, or Lucchese, it's at least worth taking a look at the mob to see if they were involved. Not to do so would be investigative malpractice. So just a few examples of many of Epstein's Israel connections. In the 1990s, with his then mentor, Leslie Wexner, he helped found the Mega Group. To become a full member of Mega, you had to be Jewish, a billionaire, and a massive supporter of Israel. And its goal? Help promote Israeli interest in American public life. 2, when Epstein's lawyers were negotiating a deal on his sexual trafficking charges in Florida, Epstein was waiting in Israel, a country with a stated policy of never deporting Jewish sex offenders, until he received a favorable deal from American prosecutors, including Alex Acosta, who would become President Trump's first Secretary of Labor. And then after Epstein served his very lenient sentence, there's a photo from the social columns. It's taken a few months after Epstein's release from jail. Not as a news article, but just as a piece in their social pages. And it shows him partying, surrounded by a number of prominent Zionists and 2 future members of Trump's cabinets. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying that any of the people in that photo were involved in any way in Epstein's crimes or his actions. But it's one of the reasons why many people speculate that Epstein was a member of the Mossad, which is the Israeli spy agency, and that some of his activities were effectively high-level compromise, taking videos and photos of prominent politicians with young girls so he could later blackmail them. To return to the Barry Sherman story. He and Jeffrey Epstein ran with the roughly same social political circle. They were both prominent Zionists. They were both massively politically influential. They were both jerks who had a long list of people who had motives for killing them. And they were both potentially murdered in exactly the same way. In December 2017, the Shermans, Barry and his wife Honey, were selling their mammoth mansion in Canada's elite rich area of North Toronto. And according to the police records, on the 15th, at approximately 10:45 a.m., a real estate agent was giving interested buyers a tour of the house. And she took them into the inner swimming pool area and saw the bodies of the Shermans hanging from the 3-foot pool rail by their necks. In what ranks up as one of the bloodiest and oddest moments in Canadian real estate history, finding the bodies of the sellers hanging dead in the middle of the house, the agent didn't phone the police. Rather, she closed the door so the buyers couldn't see the bodies, ushered them politely out of the house, and then called one of the Sherman family members in Florida. And only after that, called 911 an hour later. And when the police arrived, they discovered that there were no signs of a forced entry, and that both Honey and Barry Sherman had money in their wallets. In Honey's case, the official search warrant reveals that she had over $7,500. So robbery wasn't considered a motive in their death. And there are also extraordinary similarities between the Jeffrey Epstein and Barry Sherman death. They were both botched by the original investigators in almost exactly the same way. In both cases, the friends, colleagues, and families of Sherman and Epstein insist there was no indication of any self-harm on the part of their loved ones. But at first, the police resolutely refused to believe them. And two, everything in the cases depended on an accurate analysis of the hanging wounds of the hyoid bone in their neck. The police examiners said that the wounds on Honey Sherman, the wife, were indicative of murder. Yet they wrote off virtually the same wounds on Barry Sherman as suicide. And it's often the case that a hyoid bone would be broken in a strangulation or homicide. But neither of the Sherman's hyoid bones were broken, but Epstein's was broken in 3 places. Thus, at first the Sherman deaths were written off as a, quote, murder-suicide. That Barry Sherman killed Honey because she wanted a divorce, and then overcome with remorse and guilt, he killed himself. The Sherman family largely denounced this claim, and a few weeks later, like Jeffrey Epstein's brother, hired a prominent senior medical examiner. He did an autopsy of Sherman's bodies and claimed that the neck and wounds indicate that the Shermans had been tied up and then hung. And he pointed out, exactly like Jeffrey Epstein, that there was a thin mark on the wrists that indicate the Shermans could have been tied up. There were also similar things that dogged the Epstein investigation. If it were a suicide, why would Barry Sherman have chosen a low, 3-foot-high pool railing to kill his wife and then hang himself? As a practical murder weapon, it makes absolutely no sense. It does, however, have a symbolic power if it were an arranged killer. 2 of Canada's richest people at home beside that very image of wealth and intimacy, their own indoor swimming pool, hanging dead like executed criminals in medieval France. Now, 3 years after those killings, the Toronto Star got access to the police's second investigation and discovered there was a whole host of alleged sordid motives among the interview notes. And arguably, chief among them was the allegation that Barry Sherman owed over $1 billion to various companies and different people in Israel. And I spoke with a Canadian investigator soon afterwards. I was fascinated, like the rest of Canada, about the mystery and who could have killed 2 of our richest people with no convictions or even arrests. That investigator smiled an ironic smile and said, quote, Barry Sherman tried to do in Israel what he'd done so often in Canada. He tried to rip somebody off. And they don't mess around often with lawsuits. Someone came in, killed them, displayed their bodies so everyone gets the message that you don't mess around, and left the country that day. Again, I want to be very clear. This is not to claim that there is necessarily an Israeli link in either death. This is just speculation of one unrelated investigator and a whole bunch of interview notes in the Sherman case. Indeed, I want to point out that one of Barry Sherman's sisters, herself a prominent member of the Zionist community in Canada, claimed that it was most likely that her brother and sister-in-law had been killed by Islamic terrorists. In fact, on the other side, Sherman's house had been the scene of a noisy protest organized by the Jewish Defense League. That's an organization once on the FBI's list of terrorist groups when he was announced publicly as a prominent financial supporter of Justin Trudeau. So, I'm only going to add 4 facts to this case. 1. A former Mossad agent, Ari Ben-Menashish, claimed that Jeffrey Epstein was connected with the Israeli intelligence agency. 2. The former Secretary of Labor in Trump's first cabinet, Alex Acosta, who gave before Jeffrey Epstein such a sweetheart judicial deal for his sexual trafficking, he would claim in a presentation that was widely reported by Politico that he had done so. He'd given this sweetheart deal to Jeffrey Epstein because he had been told that Epstein was connected with intelligence. 3. At the level that Epstein played, connections with an ex-Israeli prime minister, ex-American presidents, to-be American presidents, and British royalty, he didn't need to be a sworn member of Mossad. He was just automatically what Viktor Ostrovsky, that's another former Mossad agent, claimed were the hanger-on circle, the Cyans, the friends of Israel who would help the country in any way they could. 4. Viktor Ostrovsky, as an ex-Mossad agent, was also the author of a series of blockbuster books on what he claims is the deeply rooted corruption inside his former Israeli spy agency. His essential theory is that by the 1980s, the Mossad was essentially a bunch of grifters ready to be hired out to almost any government, corporate agency, or rich, wealthy person who wanted to do something scummy in the world. There was obviously a couple of exceptions, Palestinians and various other Arab nations, but generally that was the rule. Thus, the similarities between the two deaths are striking. Both men had a lot of enemies. Both men ran with a very powerful set of politicians and business people. Both men had deep connections with the Zionist movement in Israel. And both investigations were screwed up by normally reputable police agencies like the FBI and the Toronto Police. And all the killings featured examinations of that very same bone in the neck. The police and government examiners said those neck breakages must mean that it was suicide, despite someone in the Sherman case definitely being murdered, Honey, the wife. And the same need for the families, Epstein and Sherman's, to call in an independent examiner who examined the same break in the hyoid neck bone and declared it a homicide. There was the same hanging of the bodies in oddly low places of only 3 and 4 feet high. And there was the same media suppression of the coverage. Just as every mainstream corporate media outlet in America, with the exception of Fox News, but certainly CBS 60 Minutes, New York Times, or CNN, immediately declared Epstein's death a suicide, and anyone who thought otherwise was a conspiracy theorist. The only major Canadian media outlet, that's the Toronto Star, where I worked briefly, to compare the two deaths, ruled that the Shermans were, of course, murders. But they said, of course, anyone who said that Jeffrey Epstein's death was not a suicide had to be a conspiracy theorist. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the fundamental problem of Jeffrey Epstein's death. Any attempt of a serious examination of the case has been immediately shut down. There has been no credible government investigation or proper inquiry. Important leads, questions, other cases like the Sherman murders have been ignored or downplayed. I'll now turn over the case to the defense, who will argue that Jeffrey Epstein must have committed suicide. And while you listen to those arguments, I ask you to remember only one thing. Every single government investigator who examined that case risked their very career if they came up with any other explanation than the officially accepted version of Epstein's mysterious death in that closed cell in a New York jail.